Without objection, the quorum call is dispensed with.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss America's relationship with our Eastern European friends, as well as the challenges America faces with our relationship with Russia. Over the last decade in the United States, I have been a champion of NATO and worked diligently to increase membership in the alliance. I've also been active in improving our image in Eastern Europe through expansion of the visa waiver program at the request of our friends and allies in Eastern Europe. My passion for foreign relations stems in large part from my history as a supporter of Ohio's diverse ethnic communities. As mayor of Cleveland and governor of Ohio, I gained a keen understanding of Europe from my close work with constituents with ties to countries that were once subject to life behind the Iron Curtain. This is went on for my days. My first paper in undergraduate school is how the United States sold out Yugoslavia at Tehran and Yalta. We did see the Berlin Wall fall and the Iron Curtain torn, thanks in part to the efforts of Pope John Paul II, President Reagan, and President George H.W. Bush. But even with the end of the Cold War, I was deeply concerned that darker forces in Russia could once again reemerge as a threat to democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, not just for the Russian people, but for the newly freed captive nations of Eastern Europe. I understood that getting those nations into NATO would make the alliance more vibrant and healthy and give them safe harbor from the possible threat of Russian expansionism. One of my proudest moments in the Senate was being present at Prague in March of 2002 in the room when Lord Robertson announced that 7 countries, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, were invited to join NATO. When I was governor of Ohio and chairman of the National Governors Association, I led an effort in '98 to secure passage of an all 50-state resolution in support of NATO expansion for the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Now, these new members have brought great vigor to the NATO alliance and are now some of our strongest allies working alongside our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Afghanistan. As such, I was astounded last week to see the Obama administration appear to turn its back on some of our staunchest NATO allies. Last week's missile defense announcement was made with little advance notice or consultation and disregarded the great political capital expended by the leaders of Poland and the Czech Republic. This decision leaves the impression that the United States is dealing unilaterally with Russia without regard to our NATO allies. And regardless of the merits of the decision itself, and I had a chance to talk with Secretary Gates about it, and it makes sense that this was a good decision. But the manner in which it was revealed to Warsaw and Prague was a major public relations and public diplomacy blunder. The Polish people are up in arms about the decision, not so much with the decision, but the way it was handled and the disregard for handling it in a proper fashion. The fact also that the decision was announced on September 17, 2009, the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland, makes it even worse. The way this decision was communicated shabbily to Poland and the Czech Republic should also send a shiver down the spines of our brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe and their Baltic neighbors, who are concerned with Russia's aggressive efforts to reassert its influence in what was once the Soviet Union. In an opinion piece in a Friday edition of the Washington Post, David J. Kramer of the German Marshall Fund notes that, quote, "Whatever the official explanation now for not moving forward, many, including the Kremlin, will read this shift as an effort to placate Moscow. Announcing the decision ahead of President Obama's meeting with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev this week in Pittsburgh reinforces such thinking," end of quote. Madam President, I had the opportunity this past July to travel to the Baltic states with my friends Senator Durbin, Cardin, and Wicker as part of the U.S. delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to the Parliamentary Assembly that was held in Vilnius, Lithuania. As part of that trip, I also visited Riga, Latvia, a stop that marked the highest-ranking U.S. official visit to Latvia in over 3 years. In all of our bilateral meetings with presidents, prime ministers, and foreign ministers from former Soviet countries, or countries that the Soviet Union exercised influence over, we were told that it was comforting for them to know that their membership in NATO serves as a hedge against a potentially expansionist Russia. We should be worried about the uncertainty surrounding a Russia that is reverting back to a KGB-ruled country seeking to weaponize its oil and natural gas resources as a means to expand its influence on Europe and the West. And I think that one of the concerns that we all ought to have is that the European Union, members of the European Union, instead of coming together and negotiating with Russia over the issue of natural gas, many of them are cutting their own deals. And I think we should be very concerned that in the long run, many of those countries are not going to be able to make good decisions because of the influence Russia will have over their national gas resources. Russia has the largest reserves of natural gas. It has the 8th largest oil reserves. Moscow turned off the tap to the Ukraine last summer. They could do it again. We should also be concerned about Moscow using its control of oil and natural gas to pit members of NATO against each other. Madam President, there's much talk about resetting the U.S. bilateral relationship with Russia. Moscow seeks to regain its global stature and be respected as a peer in the international community. And there's nothing inherently wrong about this. I believe there are key areas where the United States and Russia share common cause and concern. Russia is a permanent member of the U.S. Security Council and will be essential to effective multilateral pressure on Iran to give up its nuclear program. Russia continues to have leverage on the North Korean regime and has stated that a nuclear-free Korean peninsula is in the interest of both our countries. We are partners on the International Space Station. In fact, we're going to rely on them to send our NASA people to the space station. Until the Georgia situation flared in August of last year, our government and U.S. industry were working hard on a nuclear cooperation agreement with Russia, very much like the one that we entered into with India. With the world economy as it is today, the worst thing we could do is break off communication and revert back to our Cold War positions. This week's G20 conference in Pittsburgh is an opportunity to further engage Russia and determine where we have a symbiotic relationship and what we can accomplish together for the good of the international community. Nevertheless, such a reset should not come at the expense of our Eastern European friends. Madam President, time will tell whether last week's decision will have any influence on Russian cooperation on the strategic arms reduction START or our efforts to prevent a nuclear-armed Iranian regime. In the meantime, we have to work out as we seek to rebuild, we have to work our work cut out as we seek to rebuild confidence and trust with our friends in Eastern Europe. After last week's events, I suspect that their confidence in the reliability of the United States as a partner and ally has been shaken. Madam President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.